Lamansky. So I am a missionary with a board called Pacific Rim Missions International. So for 17 years, after graduating from college and grad school, I taught at Northland Baptist Bible College in northern Wisconsin. During that time, I was in administration there as well, and then the Lord used me to pastor for about 10 of those 17 years on the weekends. Then the itch to become a pastor full-time, that is to leave the lectern for the pulpit as my primary job, just kept getting a little stronger and a little stronger. And so I'd on average get about one phone call a year. Hey, would you be interested in being our pastor? And I'd ultimately say no. So that happened for about 4 years in a row. And then that final year that we were at Northland, there were a number of calls. I'm like, okay, honey, I think this is the Lord telling us. So we ended up staying in Wisconsin because my dad, who had late stage MS, lived with us in her house for 16, almost 17 years. And if we'd have gone outside of Wisconsin, we would have had to have left him there based on Badger Care, the Wisconsin healthcare program. And I was like, we'll do it if it's the Lord's will. But anyway, so we ended up in a city called Sheboygan, which is 40 minutes north of Milwaukee, 1 hour south of Green Bay. And I served there as the pastor for 10 years. We loved it. We weren't wanting to leave, no problems. I mean, every church has got something, right? But I mean, nothing, no big problems, anything like that. But then I got this phone call from a former student of mine. His name is Dr. Tim Valiente. And Tim is a missionary with Pacific Rim Missions. And he said, Curt, Mark Kittrell, so I don't know if you know that name. His family is from South Indianapolis. His dad was a pastor there for decades, 4 brothers. Mark, okay, how big is college basketball, high school and college basketball here in Indiana? Pretty big. Believe this is true, what I'm about to tell you. Mark was Indiana's Mr. Basketball his senior year. Okay, so I've challenged him to a game of horse, but I told him, we haven't played it yet. I told him, I said, I'm going to be blind, or you're going to be blindfolded, when we play. He said, I'll still beat you. I'm like, oh, all right, that's enough slam talk.
You should just let the horse play.
Yeah, right. I tell you, so anyway, I get this phone call from Tim. He's like, we're missionaries in the Philippines, and we want to. There are over 1,000, slightly more than 1,000 Baptist churches just like yours, just on the western half of the island alone. It's one of the greatest concentration of churches in the world. And he's like, all these men keep asking us to start a seminary. Would you start a seminary? Would you start a seminary? And so they finally, Mark and Tim were talking, and they said, Tim in this conversation said, Curt, we're going to start a seminary, but neither of us has ever been in like academic administration, written a scope and sequence and put a program together. Do you have time, and would you be willing to do that? I said, Tim, I would love to do that. Okay, so this is like 7 years ago. What happens to a pastor when he helps a missionary work? A little piece of his heart goes there. So fast forward 5 years later, and Mark Kittrell and I are talking on the phone. He said, Curt, you know that we've gone from the 1 location now to 7 locations. At that time it was 7. There's now an 8th school that has been opened. So, I mean, we've got, 5 locations in the Philippines. They're all seminaries, 2 Bible colleges in India and another Bible college in Myanmar. And he said, we're out of control. We need help. Would you please consider, pray about coming on board with us at Pacific Rim? So, Maria and I prayed. We said yes. Talked to the leaders of our church. Told our church a year ahead of time that we were going to be leaving, to give them up to 12 months to find a pastor. It didn't take them full 12 months, about 10 months. And so May of a year ago was my last Sunday as the pastor of a church. The new pastor is a wonderful guy, and he's doing a wonderful job. But we are now full-time missionaries. So that's why I've got the crazy looking shirt. Pastor said he's jealous of me because he has to wear the tie. I don't. But maybe when it gets really cold, you'll be thinking, nah, I've got it made. But it's never cold in churches. Usually the temperature is warm in the auditoriums. Depends on who you are. Yeah, that definition of cold. So anyway, enough introduction. That's probably too much already. We have a lot. Do you not hear this almost every Sunday from the pastors? Like, oh, I've got so much to cover. We really do have a lot to cover, but we're not going to be in a hurry. We're just going to get through as much as we can get through and not worry about the rest. So what we're going to do, and Pastor and I some months back had talked about what this might look like. He said, why don't we do kind of a Bible conference covering the book of James? Because after discussion we settled on that. I said that sounds great. So instead of me showing missionary slides and preaching more missionary type of sermons, we're going to look at the book of James as a whole. We'll sink shafts in certain portions of James more deeply, and then other portions of James that we don't have time to quite cover in depth, we'll just kind of go over in a shallower way. But we'll do as much depth as we can in the 5 sermons that we have, 2 this morning and then 1 each of the following 3 nights. So when you think of the book of James, a number of things come to mind. It's usually, for a lot of people, it's one of their favorite books in the Bible. Sometimes it's the favorite book for someone. It's a book of wisdom. It's New Testament wisdom literature. The book of Psalms and Proverbs of the Old Testament, that's similar. James is similar to that. But let's take that, the next step. What is the book of James? So I believe it is a sermon. Okay, James is literally writing down the words of a sermon, and he's sending that, we know from chapter 1, verse 1 of James, to people who used to be a part of their church in Jerusalem. They fled Jerusalem because of persecution, fear of the loss of life, and now they're mostly, according to what James says, most of the people who are reading this letter or the sermon are now in pagan territory or in Samaritan lands. They're living in places where the population is hostile toward them. Now, not as hostile as Jerusalem was, or they wouldn't have, they'd go back. I mean, it's more dangerous to live in Jerusalem, but when we see, and it won't be until Wednesday night, when we look at, or it might be Tuesday, but when we look at James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, you're going to see the peril or danger that these folks are living through. So when we read, here at the beginning this morning about, trials of life that people are going through, if we had a trial meter, that measured trials, I'm pretty certain that I could say that no one in this church is even half the level of the trials. Now, maybe someone, I don't know, but probably no one's even half the level of the trials in terms of the difficulty that they're facing, that some of the people who are reading this letter in the first century were going through. They were going through some of the most difficult, potentially spiritually derailing kind of trials that a person can experience. So that's a little bit of the backdrop. Now, what is the book of James about? To kind of gain that, let's take just a moment here to talk about James's half-brother's sermon. Jesus, of course, I'm talking about. James's half-brother of Jesus. So, what is the most famous sermon ever preached? Sermon on the Mount. What is the most commented on portion of Scripture in terms of commentaries? In the Bible, it is the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is crux, its core, It's central. So I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but James is partially, and again, this is a joke, but plagiarizing Jesus. He's not. Okay. But I mean, what Jesus is preaching in the Sermon on the Mount, basically every commentator says, wow, James is borrowing heavily from what Jesus is doing. So for us to launch into the book of James, it behooves us to talk a little bit about the Sermon on the Mount, and more particularly, what was Jesus's goal in that sermon? Because his goal, Jesus's goal, is James's goal. Same goal, okay, in both of these sermons. So what is Jesus's goal? All right, so in the Gospel of Matthew, what is the Gospel of Matthew about? You see kind of the overarching drive of the gospel in the last chapter, Matthew 28, passage we've all memorized probably, 19 and 20 or 18 through 20. And the goal is to go and teach. You could also translate that to make disciples of all nations. So as a missionary, this is what I do. This is literally what we're doing. We are going and teaching. We are 2 Timothy 2:2, finding faithful men who can teach others also. That's what our mission does with our seminaries and Bible colleges. So what is the Gospel of Matthew about? It's about making disciples from people from every nation, tribe, tongue. All right. That's the goal in Matthew. So when we go back to the Sermon on the Mount, which is the first of 5 major blocks of teaching of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, what do we find as Jesus' main purpose? It is, like Matthew 28, it is to make disciples. The Sermon on the Mount is asking the question, what is a follower of Christ? What does a follower of Christ look like? Who is that? So on the top of your notes, I believe I included this. We have Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. For I say unto you that except your righteousness exceed that of the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven. Every sermon and every lesson has one sentence that defines the whole. Whether you call that the thesis or the big idea or the proposition of the sermon, this is standard homiletics. This isn't just standard homiletics that was created in the 20th or 21st century. You find this going all the way back, whether it's Egypt or Greece or whatever. Their teachers and preachers said the exact same thing. You always have one sentence that encapsulates the entire sermon or the entire lesson. So it's not surprising that commentators argue that Jesus had one of those sentences in his sermon. He had his proposition. What is that? That sentence that we just read. The whole of the sermon is about that sentence. If you want to distill it down, it's about this idea. You are not a follower of mine. You won't be in the kingdom of heaven unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. That's his point. That's the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount. And I don't know about you, but that's like, whoa. Does that mean I'm in pretty big trouble then, spiritually? I mean, those guys were like to the nth degree righteous. I mean, they even tied the seeds that were coming out of their garden, the dill and cumin, those tiny little seeds, they would count them out. So are we all doomed? I mean, if you're not more righteous than that, then you're not going to be in heaven. Now that ought to, I'm sure the people who are sitting, listening to the Sermon on the Mount, thousands of people back in that, that day, their eyes probably went, whoa. Because nobody can be more righteous than the Pharisees. I mean, that's what you're thinking back then. Okay, so this is the thesis of the sermon, but what's the sermon about? As you then look at its context, you'll see how Jesus defines righteousness. And how does he define it? Here's how he defines it. How could you ever be more righteous than a Pharisee? Oh, it's actually really easy. Because according to Jesus' sermon, righteousness is when your inside matches your outside. That's essentially what it is. So the Pharisees are all about external righteousness. Back in Matthew 23, they're whitewashed sepulchres. In the first century, if you were a Jew and you touched a graveyard or you touched a cave that held dead bodies, what happened to you? You became ceremonial unclean. Oh man, I got 7 days. I got to sacrifice my animal. Oh, I do not want to get ceremonially unclean. So what did people back then do with the graves that held dead bodies? They painted them white to warn you. Well, when you paint it white, it looks good on the outside. But what did Jesus say in the 7 woes of Matthew 23 about the Pharisees and the scribes? You're like whitewashed sepulchres. You look good on the outside, but inside there's death and decay and it's corruption. In other words, you don't even understand what the kingdom of God is. You don't even understand what a follower, a true lover of God is. It would be like. Okay. So going back to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling most of them new followers in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, what does it look like if you want to follow me? Your righteousness is going to exceed that of the Pharisees, which means that what you want people to see on Sunday morning at church matches who you really are on the inside. I don't just portray godliness on the outside. Jesus, as a true follower, actually is godly. Now, I don't think any of us is going to raise our hands and say, I'm as godly on the inside as I am on the outside, because we do want to look good in others' eyes, but we ought to be pretty close. What you see should be what you get. All right, so that's the overarching thesis of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that James is borrowing very heavily from. What is the goal of Jesus' sermon? Okay, the goal is found some verses later. It's actually the last verse of chapter 5, and you have it on your handout here. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. Be ye therefore, and I'm put the Greek word in here for a reason, okay? Be ye therefore, now in English, in our English translations, it's always translated holy, okay? So, be ye therefore holy, even as your Father which is in heaven is holy. But I put the Greek word here for a reason. Be Teleios, even as your Father which is in heaven is Teleios. So to you and me, we read over be holy, and you're like, okay. So, the Heavenly Father's like sinlessly perfect. So Jesus is saying, I need to be sinlessly perfect. This is the goal of the disciple. That's how we typically, this is how we're going to understand this verse. This is how we're going to compute what we think Jesus is saying. What is he saying? Let me tell you what it'll take a while to develop it, but let me share what he's saying. Jesus is, I'm almost certain I know right where Jesus was standing, because Luke says Sermon on the Plain, and Matthew says it's Sermon on the Mount. There's only one place north of Capernaum where Jesus could have been standing, where it could be both plain, flat, and also a mount. He's standing literally at the pinnacle Behind him is a flat plain that goes up into other mountains, but then right down beneath him is a steep drop off. And that day there were boulders. So imagine thousands of people and kids and animals and birds and all this stuff, down here that he's preaching. And then just a short distance from where they're sitting is the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so when he is up here looking down at them preaching, he says, be holy. Everyone there would expect the Greek word, and I'll just say it, hagios. That's holy. That's the word you'd expect. That's not the word he used. Everyone sitting there, again, their eyes did another one of those. I mean, this word is so instructive. This word is deep. There's a lot with this word. And it's not the word that you would expect, because teleos never, ever, ever, ever in the Bible, or even outside the Bible in Greek from that day, never did it mean sinless perfection. It never meant that. What does it mean? Okay, now, we'll develop what it means as we move on. But this is Jesus's thrust. This is his goal. This is his definition of a follower, is someone who is teleos. There are only two places in the New Testament where you have a heavy concentration of this word. In other words, the word in noun, verb, and adjectival form is just repeated again and again and again. Two places. Now, Paul uses it. And in fact, in really crucial verses like Romans 12, 1 and 2, that's literally the goal word of Paul. It's teleos. All right, so that word is in very important places. However, all throughout the New Testament, however, there are only two places where there is a heavy concentration of this word. It just again and again and again. And it's not translated with the same English word, because this word is so deep and there's so much. You have different translations of the same word. We use different English words to try to convey it based on its context. Well, where's the other place? The first one's the Sermon on the Mount. And by now, I'm sure you know where the other place is. It's the book of James. So if we don't know teleos, if we don't understand what that is, then we're gonna understand Sermon on the Mount or James decently, right? I mean, we'll still be able to understand a lot of what's going on, but I don't think we'll understand all of the big picture without understanding that primary idea. With that, let's now continue on, and I need to watch the time. Okay, 20 minutes. So what are we going to do here in this first session? We're going to be talking about this. It's the proposition. You see it on your handout. And it is the goal of discipleship. That's what James is mostly about. I mean, there are other things in it, but this is what it's about. What is the goal of discipleship? It is to live a teleos life. As a missionary, what am I doing? I am going to other nations, and I am helping them become teleos. As a Christian, what are we supposed to be growing into? Teleosity. Okay? This is not small. This is huge stuff. So what is the goal of discipleship? Not only am I, discipling myself, but my wife, my kids, people. Okay. Everyone ought to, Dr. Les Olala, the former president of the college where I taught for a long time, used to say it like this: everyone ought to have a Paul and a Timothy in their lives. Everyone ought to have somebody dumping into their lives. Now, if you're 95 years old, okay, maybe you won't have, a Paul. But I mean, most of us are going to be able to, we're of an age, even if we're, a little more advanced, we're still able to have a Paul. So we ought to have a Paul dumping into our lives, and then we all ought to have a Timothy that we are in turn dumping into, spending time with, encouraging in Christ. So this is the goal of life, is to teach others, to make disciples of others. And the goal of discipleship, what we're trying to do, is help them be teleios as your Father in heaven is teleios. Becoming that. So what in the world is teleios? What is a teleios life? Well, it's a condition of the soul. It's the health or the lack thereof of a person's soul. Now that's just part of the idea, but that's the question we would be asking is, how healthy is our soul? Are we really, we look good, when we come to church, but inside it ain't good. There's some serious corruption. That didn't, just because there's sin doesn't mean we're not saved. All right. I think I'm with your pastor, I know preaching, I don't need to go through all that. All right. So you're solid on that. But, what are we in truth, in reality? What is a teleios life? We'll answer that question by studying 4 words in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 8. We'll look at the idea of trials, steadfastness, wisdom, and double-mindedness. So, when we talk about the book of James as a sermon, his thesis is found, his proposition is found in verse 4 of chapter 1. Let's read it. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting or lacking nothing. Okay. Which one of those words is teleios? It is the word perfect, and it's used twice. This is the thesis not only of Jesus' sermon, but of James's, is to be teleios. Now, how does James develop this idea? The idea of having like 3 points for a preacher, that's kind of like the cute modern idea. The idea of having 3 points or 2 or 4 or maybe even as many as 7 goes back to before the time of Jesus. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount has 3 points. And guess what? James's sermon has 3 points. What are those points? His first point is chapter 1, verses 2 through 25. His second point is chapter 1, verses 26 through chapter 4, verse 12. And then James's third point is chapter 4, verse 13 through chapter 5, verse 18. You have a 1-verse introduction and a 2-verse conclusion. But that's James's sermon. Now, in his sermon, what is he aiming for? He is teaching us what living a teleios life looks like. And how does he break the teleios life up? In 3 points. Point number 1, it's found, the core idea is found in verse 12 of chapter 1, which is to love God with your whole heart. That's James's first point. Love God with your whole heart. Now, what keeps us sometimes from loving God with a teleios heart? A wholly devoted heart. A heart that doesn't have a mixture of sometimes, loving God and then other times loving self and sin. What's the word that James uses for the divided heart? It's in chapter 1, verse 8. Double-minded. What is teleios? Single-minded. It's when the whole soul is devoted to a purpose. So, if my whole soul, we are to, Deuteronomy 6, we are to love God with our whole soul, our minds, our bodies, our strength, okay, everything we are. That's the first point of James, to love God with your whole heart. What detracts from that? What erodes that love? Or can, it doesn't have to, but what can erode that love? James chapter 1, verses 2 through 8. trials. Or more specifically in James, our response to trials. That can blow teleosity up. The shalom of the soul, the deep peace. Teleosity is deep peace. It's more than the things I'm saying. There's a whole bunch to it. But it's a deep sense of relaxed peace in God. We're wholly devoted to God. What's going to happen? Our soul is going to be, whoa, but trials. Oh my goodness, Curt, if you only knew. All of us have those things. What do we want as Americans? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the way the founders were using happy there, I think, is very similar to the way Jesus was using it in the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. Not happy as in, the absence of trial, but happy in the sense of I can pursue what I believe the Lord wants me to pursue. All right, so happiness, that word has been hijacked and changed today. But is it not true today that even we, as Christians in churches, what do we want in life? What are we hoping to kind of have? The absence of trial, and we want to build our bubble of ease and comfort around us. Hopefully this isn't an idol of the heart, but it can be. We want the, could we say, idol of ease and comfort, the lack of problems. This is my goal. This is why I have the 401k. It's why I want my kids to be, perfect in the eyes of others. I want everything just organized right, and I definitely don't want a flat tire when I'm heading to work. I mean, it can be something that small that will mess a person up. Me, I could be, coming down here, and then all of a sudden, I get a flat tire. And does a flat tire completely ruin my day? Well, if it did ruin my day, then I am really lacking in teleosity. Pretty badly, actually. Well, you're putting, a piece of furniture together, and, the screw strips that you're like, buy some IKEA piece of furniture. And because I'm really bad with my hands and stuff. And am I throwing my tool when something like that happens? I just spent $200 on this, whatever. I haven't. I've never even shopped at IKEA. I'm just using it. But, does that derail? All right, so the trials of life. Trials of life really tell us how teleos we are, or how far we still need to grow. Okay, so trials could mess with our love for God in a big way. What's the other thing that James says? Could erode our love for God very quickly. It's James chapter 1, verses 13 through 25. Specifically 13 through 18, it's temptation. Again, not the temptation itself, but it's our response to that temptation. If we are giving into that temptation to sin, and it's become a pattern in our lives, well, when we are choosing to sin, teleosity is instantly affected. That doesn't mean it's completely like, you pop the bubble and there's no air left. It's not that bad, but I mean, sin is eroding what God wants for us and what we want for ourselves, which is to be in a state of total rest. Okay, so this is James's first point. Now, his first point is illustrated in two ways. And so here, I'll ask this question to all of us. Don't raise your hand or don't respond, but do you think you're teleos? Do you think that you have reached the goal? And the goal is reachable. Not sinless perfection. That's not what James is saying. In fact, in chapter 3 even says we all stumble in many ways. Okay, so he's never preaching sinless perfection, but do we reach a state of deep maturity? All right, here's how James, in his first point, illustrates the difference between an individual who is teleos and who isn't. The One who isn't is like, James chapter 1, verse 6 is, and 7 and 8 actually as you go down, but in verse 6 is where he describes it, is like a wave of the sea driven with the wind and tossed. They are, going down to verse 8, double-minded. We could also say double-souled. Paul in Ephesians 4 and in Colossians 3 and other places too, he talks about the two natures of the Christian, the redeemed nature and the sinful nature, the old man and the new man. And what does he say is crucial? To put off the old man and put on the new by the renewing of the mind. Okay. So Paul says it, James says it, Jesus says it. For a believer, there can be, and it's unfortunately too real in my life, there can be this going back and forth between the natures, sometimes struggling, sometimes walking with Christ. And so for James, he says, look, if you want to be Teleios, okay, then when trial comes, James chapter 1, verse 2, you count it all joy. Count it all joy when ye fall into diverse temptations or diverse trials. Wow. Trial comes, and I am to consider that trial as an opportunity for deep joy? Yeah, because it draws us closer to God. It grows us spiritually. It is one of the steps in becoming Teleios, developing a soul that is yielded completely to God. So when a trial comes, and you can think back, let's say in the last month, what's the biggest trial that, don't respond, but what's the biggest trial that happened to you, whether you're 15 years old or 50? What's the biggest trial that happened to you in the last month? Maybe somebody in here was diagnosed with, you got the call from the nurse. Yeah, you need to come in. Your blood work, or yeah, we tested that lump or something like that. It could be that big, or it could be as small as the flat tire. But when that happens, what did your soul look like? So here are James's two illustrations. Illustration number 1, did our souls look like a wave of the sea driven by the wind and tossed? Or, a little bit later in the chapter, did our souls look at chapter 1, verse 17, from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Most people do not understand what that verse means. Variableness or shadow of turning. I don't even care what translation you use, whether it's King James or some modern translate. No matter how you translate this, most people don't get what this is saying. This is the other illustration. So is our soul Teleios or not? Are we, when trial comes, like a wave of the sea driven by the wind and tossed, or are we like verse 17? So wave of the sea driven by the wind and tossed. So when trial comes, whether we're smiling or not on the outside, when we get down to, oh man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay this bill this month, do we have a knot in our stomach when we go to bed? Oh, is inside of our soul, is there a storm going on? Like a wave of the sea driven by the wind and tossed. I live 15 minutes drive from Lake Michigan. And in the summertime, we have 3 surfboard shops in our city. We're considered like the Malibu of the Midwest is what our city is called. Because the waves are large. We have surfers every day, even in the wintertime until the ice comes. There are people in not wetsuits, but dry suits who are surfing almost every day. It's up there crazy, I think. right. Anyway, they're out there, they're having fun. But during the wintertime, the waves get larger and larger. And then in the storms in the winter, those waves get 80, 90 feet high. Okay, when not like they're rolling in at that height, but when they hit the piers, they'll splash 80 to 90 feet high. So it almost sounds like a tsunami. It's not a tsunami, but when they hit some solid ground, they will go up and over the lighthouse that's on the end of the North Pier. Now that lighthouse has been there for decades, and guess what? It leans actually slightly, but it has withstood storm after storm, winter after winter, weather unbelievable. I don't know how it is able to still be standing, seeing pictures of waves that completely cover and engulf that thing. The power of water. So, in a normal summer day, you look at the waves, they're somewhat large, but what do you see with those waves? At the top of the waves, there's white, there's froth. If it's windy day, you'll see the water droplets blowing around. Is that illustrating what is happening inside of our souls when trial comes? If so, then we are far from the teleosity that Jesus and James is describing. If, however, when trial comes, we are like our Father, be Teleios, even as your Father in heaven is Teleios. Okay, that was Jesus. Well, that's what James is saying too. What does a Teleios Christian look like? They're not double-minded. They're not double-souled where they're just going back and forth. When trial comes inside, they're all like this. No, instead, when trial comes, they are like the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. So what does that mean? Here's what it means. Our Father in heaven is not, and this is almost like wrong to even to suggest it, he is not biting his nails when Curt's driving through snow to get to a church. Oh no, I don't know if Curt's going to make a move. He is never, ever even slightly worried. What is our Father like? Is he like a wave of the sea driven by the wind and tossed, and all the problems, in his universe are like, doing that to him? That is patently absurd. What is he like? He's like a shadow that doesn't shift. Or put the opposite, the Bible puts it, he is not even like a shifting shadow. There's no variableness. There's no shifting when the shadow is moving or turning. So, if I go outside, it's a sunny day here now, somewhat. So if I go outside, you'd laugh at me, right? If I stood there and I said, "What are you doing, Curt?" "Well, I'm watching my shadow to see it move." You'd be like, "Okay, this missionary's got,